year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
Can I ask everybody to make POIs audibly and also raise your hands so that I can see that you have asked a POI? I'll count myself down. 3, 2, 1. Today's science is more politicized than ever. We live in a society in which we realize that whenever we want something to appear in the papers, we need it for it to come from academic institutions that are trusted by broader society. This understanding means that academic institutions are influenced by politics, and when politics are influenced by corporates, we realize that this influence transcends the integrity of knowledge. First, on what this debate is about, how these bans will look like, as well as 2 arguments on public interest and educational legitimacy. So, what is this debate about? This debate is about governmental legitimacy of intervening in these instances and about how to best fulfill the role of educational institutions within society. We will prove to you that these rules and purposes are best fulfilled when corporations don't fund research. But what do these bans look like? The government, through conventional supervisions of corporations, inspects that they're not sending money for researches to colleges, universities, or specific higher educational schools focused on research. Generally, corporations already have to disclose when they're using their money and how they're using, as well as universities have to disclose who is funding their projects. We do support other forms of funding from places that are more we support alumni funding. We support forms of funding such as, for example, the university disclosing a larger part of its money instead of focusing on the football team, focusing on research that comes from academia. Notice how this is not a consequentialist measure. It is a measure that understands inherent common harms that are enough of an incentives for corporations to create harm. With that in mind, let's look into our first argument on public interest. We tell you that these institutions have broader societal legitimacy that creates public trust, and because there's an absence of bias. This translates into policy and politics, it translates into media, and it translates into every single aspect of ideology. But when does the government intervene in the public interest, and why is this bias generated whenever institutions try to intervene? First of all, the government intervenes when people don't have information to consent to the harms that are being presented to them. This is why we ban fake news in social media, because it can put people in danger. This is even more harmful for corporations when people can start consuming products that can be nocive for their health. When the harm to the person is so large and so long-term that the government overrides people's interests and rights to choose, this is what happens whenever we are creating this ban. But why does corporate-funded research harm the population? Firstly, because there's leverage over the results that are going to be presented. This is, for example, when a comparison of two similar products is being made in the contract that people are signing whenever they're going to do their research, even if it's by marginal benefits, one of the products is going to be shown better than the other. This is, for example, how in the 90s, bottled water companies funded research to tell you that you need to drink 8 glasses of water a day when it's not even necessary. Secondly, because it limits and censors what is going to be presented within the media. What we mean is basically that whenever you're creating a research or academic paper, you basically don't have to now disclose everything that you have stumbled upon, especially within the contractual agreements. It has said that you can hide certain aspects. You're allowed to do so. You are not lying to the public. You're just censoring certain results. Thirdly, about the politicization of the markets. Even if the results turn out to go against the favor of the company itself, we understand that what ends up happening is that the public, and especially the corporations and the people writing the papers, are going to twist what is already presented in order to benefit the products that are sold. This misinforms the people, and it changes the way it changes their conscious and understanding of what are they're consuming, and people can end up consuming things that are harmful for them. And even if not, they're just not receiving the full scope of information. And we tell you that there's always an inherent interest for these companies to do so. Basically, we tell you that they have an interest for profit, and when the public is being told by a legitimate source that they are going to consume something that is beneficial for their health, this is going to be influential. But what happens if there's no effect on the research? We tell you that there's already a big risk, and the harms of a handful are enough for us to ban the entire premise. And if they say that every other form, that it's the only form of funding for these institutions and that they are not able to access money from everybody else, they're conceding to us that there's no real consent for the people who are writing this research to present information. The impact of this is that we're fulfilling the role of the government, and we are legitimizing the public's trust towards these institutions. But side op disagrees. I'll take your point.
Look, on their side, in real world, universities and other academic institutions get money from the government as well. Why does politicization not happen on your side of the house?
We understand that point, but the thing is that many governments don't really necessarily have the same profit incentives that these corporations have. We also believe that they have a far larger obligation to providing education and with it research to these institutions, so we claim those benefits. There's going to be some analysis on this in my second argument that is about the education illegitimacy. So In this argument, we tell you that the limitations of research as a free intellectual endeavor limit the scope of knowledge in broader society and overburden researchers that research within a particular result in mind. The thing is that when you research with a particular result in mind, you're not able to publish other findings, especially whenever you are already signing a contractual agreement with these companies. You can have a hypothesis of what's going to happen, but it should not be what is going to funnel the way in which you are creating this research in the first place. First, on the purposes of educational institutions. We tell you that these are houses of knowledge. They promote intellectual endeavors, they train students, and they basically promote further knowledge and its application. We tell you that by forcing people, we are minimizing this liberty of this research and with it the scope of knowledge. If people want to complete the research that they need in order to continue on their tenure track, in order not to be fired or just reach a certain minimum, whenever they have a choice of funding from a large institution that can bring them a larger workforce, this means that they have an obligation to sometimes create research that does not go with their integral values. They're forced to cooperate with institutions. They're forced to create research that is not necessarily within their broader interests. We tell you that this limits the academic method and they're forced to rush the process, which can have harmful results because whenever these institutions and these corporations want for the academic institutions to bring them the information fast so that they can apply them in marketing, this is the moment in which they rush the process. This affects the researchers and students alike. The students learn that this is the way of the academic process. And additionally, we are harming the process in general because of two scapegoats. First, the scapegoat of the government that is unlikely to fund for the particular interests of the universities when corporations are already funded, and the scapegoat for university who are more likely to just invest in football teams and other visual appeals instead of research. Education institutions lose value and the liberty and intent of research is minimized.
I would like to thank First Prop for their address, and I now invite First Op. Just give me a moment, First Op, to screen share the timer, unless you also would not like it.
Can I start?
Yep.
Can you hear me well? Because there's rain outside and...
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay.
How would you prefer to get POI, sorry?
Audible, please, because I cannot assure that I will see you otherwise. Panel, we think that the broad case out of proposition brought to you was just give you a bunch of reasons why corporations who are profit-driven are bad, they want to manipulate the public, so on and so forth. However, what they didn't do was analyze to you, first of all, at the point to which these corporations have such a big incentive to manipulate people into buying their products, why would they not look for other alternatives to fund independent research or provided research themselves? But secondly, they also haven't done to you enough. Why regulating on how these corporations manipulate these academic institutions to provide research themselves doesn't work, right? We did it on side of opposition. We can also support regulations which can cut off this bad harm that a proposition talks about, right? We can support that we make it transparent at the point to which certain academic research is going to be funded, certain research is going to be funded directly by some company. And second of all, we think that we can also support regulations which maintain that only credible research is to be published at the point to which we have clear enough reasons to believe that something is being published only for manipulating the public, this is bad, and so on. Secondly, the second problem that they have is also not talking enough about how you're actually not eliminating the problem in itself. We think that companies need research not only to manipulate the public, but we think that largely what actually happens in the status quo is that companies actually depend on having research be provided for them because they want to make like better products for the consumers, because they want like to create better technologies with which they can be more competitive on the market. This is actually beneficial for society, as we'll prove in our arguments, but also it gives companies a big enough incentive to all look for other ways to fund this research, to independent research, or setting up this research labs themselves. We don't think that they eliminate the issue in itself. Thirdly, we think at the point of we think that at the point of which we also, I'll talk about this in my argument, but these schools also depend from like private donors, from government funds, thus they have incentives not to be manipulated and be coerced, and to talk about. So first two arguments will largely be incorporated, like integrated in my constructive, but still, first of all, their argument first talks about how there's like this public interest, how people are being manipulated, and how there's like this sort of manipulation through media and so on. We think that Mateusz gives you a POI in first, which they don't actually respond to, right? But where he tells you at the point of which you're talking about how governments themselves are allowing this to happen and are allowing are politicized and are supporting this corporation, this is still able to happen on their side of the house, right? Because these governments are still funded by these corporations. They want to be re-elected, so they will probably support this sort of things happen in the future. Secondly, when they talk about academic integrity and legitimacy, right? We don't think that this is like it doesn't happen in the status quo. If you want this academic integrity and legitimacy, you're still able to do independent research in the status quo. We don't see why they are absolutely coerced, but furthermore, this will be talked about in my argumentation. We will have three constructive points inside of opposition today. I will take you after this. Firstly, I'll talk about how we comparatively generate better research on our side of the house. Secondly, how we actually help poor communities who don't have access to research themselves and don't have access to good education. Jana will talk about how we get better societal impacts through generating better knowledge. Before I go on to the first constructive, I'll take the POI.
What research is more likely to be trusted? Something that is published in the Harvard University Press, or something that is just claimed by a certain independent?
I will talk about this issue in my argument, right? Firstly, we think that at the point of which corporations won't be able to fund academic institutions, they will look for alternatives, right? They will create a research lab themselves, or they will create independent research, which they don't want funds, right? We think that generally public doesn't make their opinions solely through scientific consensus. We think that they generally make their decisions based on how this products that they consume or whatever they consume actually have experienced them with themselves in the first place. But we think that actually at the point of which we take them at their best, we think that worse like research is going to be produced on this other house, right? We did on a comparative, academic research has better incentives to maintain and to be credible. Why? Because academic schools have a reputation to maintain, right? We think that they have to be seen as credible in the status quo because at the point of which they have a reputation of being academically integrity and so on, they attract better students, they have better enrollment, they extract better funds from private donors and so on. We think they rely on this funding as well, not only on private corporations, thus they have certain incentives to maintain a picture that they're not just a yes man for a corporation. Secondly, we think that research published in academic circle is actually going to be better. Why? Because it works in academic circles at the point of when you all publish some research, you also have peer reviewers or experts check on your work. You have mentors who overlook what you do. People who already have enough knowledge are respectable, and thus they don't want to risk their integrity. But secondly, where the people also test your results. Others people can create response papers. They can dispute your claims. You have incentives that when you produce something, when you produce certain research, you're going to likely to have to maintain credibility and integrity. We think that academics do just have good incentives to maintain reputation because they need good enrollment, they need more sponsors, they have this role to maintain. With that, on a comparative, they're going to be a lot careful what sort of results they produce, which are credible. We think that at the point of which you take that away, when you ban it, these companies will now look for other mechanisms. And when people are going to make their opinions based on certain scientific research, this is still going to be possible on your side of the house. Secondly, we think that it's actually going to be better for communities which don't have other access to this implementation, right? We need research largely, which gives like corporations certain knowledge that they need, right? It's actually very expensive right now. You need certain lab equipment, you need enough of pool, enough of people to understand it, you need some sort of background, you need something to build from in the first place. We think that new and like academic institutions for poorer communities or just people who come from poorer backgrounds have a harder time accessing those tools, those equipment in the first place. They lack sponsors, they lack state funding, they have bad equipment. This is bad for two reasons. Firstly, because it's bad for people who don't have other options, who come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, and thus the education that they get isn't like the maximum basket that they can have. But also because now these schools who come from these backgrounds cannot be competitive, they cannot attract enough funding to create good research in the first place. Which then the proposition takes away the capital that comes from them necessarily for these corporations. And we think these corporations target these schools and target these people because they have been target these people because they want to have research provided for them, and at the point of which these people don't come from backgrounds where they can fund them themselves. They don't come from elite schools which can give them that sponsorship, right? These people now have an incentive to create research for them. We think this creates good impacts for two reasons. Firstly, it gives these people a chance to actually gain academic recognition, to kickstart off their careers because you give them the capabilities to do that. But secondly, you directly offer them employment they can elevate themselves and so on. We think that corporations have a tendency to do that because they when the point of which they're able to get good research, this directly benefits them. They want to have products which are good for consumers, which are good for the market. They need and rely on that, right? They don't rely on something that only like gives them an answer that they want, but the answer that they need in order to be competitive, in order to be a good company. We think that people like can get better access to education. We give schools which don't have access to that in the first place better chances of attracting people to be more competitive, to gain better students, and to gain better people, to gain better possibilities for these people. Because of those reasons, because we're the ones who uniquely do that, we're so happy to be on side of opposition.
I would like to thank the first op speaker, and I now invite second prop.
Would it be possible to also remove the screen share of the timer so that I can see people doing POIs? Thank you so much. I would also prefer if you do POIs both audibly and like raise your hand or do something that I can see, because sometimes I just don't hear when you say those things, but thank you. In the 19th, students from the universities of McMaster, U Toronto, and U Pennsylvania were expelled from their universities for not wanting to comply with the brands and the research of those who are funding their institutions. The fact that proposition not once tells you why they would prefer for this to happen, even when these companies do actually interfere with the legitimacy of this research, is because they cannot win this debate. 2 points of clash on my speech. First, on the effectiveness of the ban, and second, on the repercussions on the educational sector. And finally, a third argument on underserved prestige. Let's talk about the effectiveness of the ban. The first thing we tell you is that the metric that we established for when this ban would be legitimate is that there is a potential for abuse, and that the harms of when this abuse would happen are so large that we also believe it is justified to ban like the sponsorship of corporations, even in instances when like these corporations aren't actively interfering with the legitimacy of this research. When we tell you that these consequences look like climate change denial, which is something that affects all of us because it literally affects our livelihood, we believe that these are substantial harms that opposition didn't really respond to. But secondly, let's talk about the regulations that they try to bring in their speech. First, these are regulations that already exist, right? There is no government that tells corporations you can fund research that actively lies to people, that actively promotes your products, even if they do are harm to society. They have to prove to you that their counterfactual is something that is effective and is something that is enough. But let me give you the strict link as to why I believe there is an immense incentive for corporations to do this. The first reason is because they are fundamentally for profit, and this profit derives immensely from their public opinion on these goods. If these individuals don't believe that their goods are like good for them, or if they believe that there are like broader ethical implications, for example, in the production of these goods, then the demand will fall, and therefore these companies don't receive a profit, and therefore we believe that like this research does directly affect these companies. But specifically, I believe that the most harmful products are oftentimes also the most profitable products. When we talk about, for example, addictive drugs and pharmaceuticals that are extremely profitable, or when we literally talk about like oil and big oil companies that really harm the earth and perpetuate things such as climate change, we believe that when these are the most profitable products in the market, there's a never greater incentive for these to happen. But now let me make two comparatives on like the alternatives that they give you. They tell you that when the government like also funds these sorts of institutions, which already kind of like contradicts their second argument as to how small schools are going to die, I believe that this is still better than corporations funding these sorts of things. First, because if the government funds absolutely every university, then there is no bias, because it is like the same standardized sort of metric that the government is going to impose on all of them. Whereas corporations can impose bias on like certain institutions and therefore rupture the market in that sense. The second thing I would say is that I think it's easier for us to hold the government accountable for these sorts of things than it is for us to hold corporations accountable. Why? Because if like you go against the interests of the government and they remove funding, you can protest against that, because like a government needs to give you education because that is a right that you have to demand from them. Whereas if you lose like private funding from a private institution, then there's no way for you to hold them accountable, because it's basically like a favor that they are doing to you. What is the impact of this point of clash? I believe at the end of the day, I do prove to you that like the ban is the most effective way for us to limit the harms of these corporations. And when we recognize that these are harms that are substantial, I believe that that is important. But secondly, let's talk about the educational repercussions, specifically addressing their first and second arguments. Their first argument, they talk about how like because these institutions have a reputation to maintain, then it is more likely for like them not to engage in these sorts of things. First, this literally ignores the status quo where these things already happening. And also, like it is mitigatory at the extent when they also concede that some universities literally like need this funding in order to survive, and therefore they like won't jeopardize like survival for legitimacy. But the second thing that I would say is that precisely because they have this huge reputation, because there's the University of Chicago, because there's Harvard University or Stanford University, is that much less likely for them to be disputed, or even for those disputes that they credit so much as like their regulatory system and their counterfactual to like stick in the first place. But the second thing they talk about is like how these poor communities are not going to receive funding. First, I believe that like there are different types of universities, right? There are like liberal arts universities and there's research universities. I think that research universities usually don't target this like sector of society anyway. But what we would say is that as a society, we recognize that like university has a plethora of good effects on society, because it makes us more productive human beings, because it generates knowledge that we can all use in like economics and mathematics and just like medicine in every single sense. Therefore, I believe that there is an active incentive to always fund these sorts of things. I think there are like four alternatives. It can be government funding, it can be alumni sponsorship, it can be literally from the tuition, or just like this being self-sustainable. I believe that these types of funding are likely precisely because these individuals believe that their success comes from like what the educational institution gave to them in the first place. I believe that they have a feeling of like owing something back to the university, and therefore this funding is likely to happen in that sense. But now let's talk about the impacts that they never really address on our case. First, we tell you that like research is an intellectual endeavor. It is something that like should be free, and people should allow to just research the things that they want. This is something that is actively limited by their side when a company tells you, you have to research this, give me this result, or tells them like you can't go into this specific topic. Before I move on, go.
Look, they never respond to Emma's challenge, which is why governments will not abuse this power they talk about.
Look, I gave you an entire analysis with my first argument as to why I believe that even if the government does sponsor these things, I think it's comparatively better. Please actually listen to my speech. But the second impact we tell you is that we believe that like this actually actively jeopardizes research, and this doesn't only have the impact of like the content is going to be less quality, but also like research institutions also train individuals and students to be researchers. So in the moment when they are corrupted and when they are told that these sorts of things and like changing your methodology and not having to make sure that your results are absolutely valid is something that we impose on these students, then this can like transcend to these individuals going to research for pharmaceuticals, which are medicines that we literally put in our bodies, or in other areas. We believe that the repercussions of this are huge. Let me talk about our third third argument when we talk about underserved prestige. Essentially, we believe that that in the status quo, we are creating illegitimate competition among universities precisely because of the funding that these corporations are giving to them in terms of research. In many instances, the ranking given to these universities depends on the rigor of their research programs, and that from a perception level depends on the amount of money that they have for research, which is just really derivative of whether or not they have private funding or not. This looks like, for example, how in the United Kingdom, funding from the government goes to universities that bring about the greatest amount of research. Now, I believe that this has many impacts. The first one of which is the loss of talent. I believe that the most competitive students, the ones that have the most potential to be beneficial, not only within these universities, but also to grow out of the university and be extremely productive members of society, will go to the universities that are the most ranked. Insofar as these universities have this extreme ties to these private corporations, I believe we have a massive loss of talent and a massive opportunity cost to the benefits that we have in society as a whole. But the second thing is that I believe that corporations and NGOs in general seek out these universities to help them and cooperate with them in larger projects. This looks like how Oxford and different pharmaceutical companies right now are collaborating to create a vaccine for COVID-19. I believe that in the moment when the ranking itself is illegitimate, is based on how much private money you have, then the whole system falls to the ground and it is not meritocratic. It is not something that people deserve and it yields worse results. Overall, we tell you we lose legitimacy of the government, we lose legitimacy of these educational institutions, and society is incredibly worse off. So proud to propose for Team Mexico.
I would like to thank the second prop speaker, and I now invite second op.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
I would like to ask you for the audible POIs, and that is more or less all. Dear panel, what the team of opposition proposition is doing in this debate is two things. One, they are making the universities that rely on companies to give them money to make research, such as Munich University for the Polytechnic, right? Or for example, they make the companies that need the universities to do the research for them, for example, to know what sort of engines they are using in, for example, Volkswagen or stuff like that. They're making these people be unable to utilize the ability of each other. While at the same time, they are making it impossible for the great research, such as the COVID-19 research they're talking about, to actually happen, because you need so much money for that to happen. And when pharmaceutical companies do not give you that money more, you are without it, which means that they are bringing us two great harms, while at the same time not even making great impacts. With this in mind, I'm going to do three points of rebuttal and reconstruction, and then I'm going to move on to my construction. So firstly, on the cultural capital that they're talking about, notice that they have two major problems here. Firstly, they're talking as to how these companies are making these universities richer because they invest in them. But notice that that is not correct. These companies invest into these universities because they are already so influential, so rich, because they have the best students. And at the point of which you do not have this money coming to this university anymore, this will not mean that they will be now less important and less better than the other company and the other universities. This only means that they will now have less money for the research being done then, but they will still be the best university in the world. So they have no impact here. While on the other hand, which is the reconstruction of our second argument, they're making the pupils that actually go to the universities that are not that well off, but are still interesting to the companies that, for example, want to research specific sort of, I don't know, cloth, and that, for example, this cloth is made in a specific country, let's say in Slovenia, and that this specific university is very good at making it, the company will be very likely to invest into that university, even if it is not rich, which means, no thank you, that it will give the people, the students there, the opportunity to actually be important, to get research ties, to get employed, and to have much better lives than they would otherwise have. So this is the comparative that you have to take into account in this first one. Now, the second question we have to think about is what sort of influence do governments and lobbies have on the research that happens here. Notice that they have a clear problem in this thing, because they say that governments, when they fund the universities, this will be much better because now you will be actually able to hold them accountable. But notice that governments already are funding those universities, no thank you, but there's no one calling them out for any political interferences. That means that if there is no problem with the governments in the status quo, then obviously there is no influence of theirs on companies anyway, but that's obviously what the status quo tells us. But on the other hand, if there is a problem actually happening, but there is no reporting on it, this will also happen in their work. However, notice that there are much more important factors that will still stay on their side, such as lobbies that will still be able to finance Oxford, which means that Oxford will still be unable to go against them if they are actually as important and as strong and as the team proposition wants us to be. So in any way, no thank you. On either side of the house, if there is great lobbying power, they are not solving it with their money. But there is a clear comparative, which is how much research we can get with the money coming. So if the government just pays the lobby just pays some headmaster in order for him to prevent some sort of research to happen, we have no benefits to the research that could have been done if lobby just gave money to the research, making the opportunity of the people. Now, the second question, the third and last question that we have to talk about is the influence on the people, because what they are actually trying to tell us that these researchers are actually influencing people extremely. No, thank you. But you have to recognize that a lot of people, do not even care about information. The point of which people actually believe Trump when he says that they should drink that I don't know what thing that can kill them in order to not get ill for the COVID-19. It's obvious that they don't care about the research. But secondly, those that actually care do not really care where does this research comes from. So the comparative that we have is that this research actually comes from Harvard, when we have some sort of researchers that actually care about their reputation, researchers that do not get only paid by the company, but also work as the professor in a specific school, or on your side, having only the companies having their own research groups in their department and making some fake information, which means that they have a lot more power to make this research be actually biased comparatively to what we have in the status quo. I will take it now.
So you don't prove to us why that is necessarily we would actually say that that's not necessarily the case, because we think institutions that are only focused on scientific research, for example, are much more regulated, and those are the ones that are challenged the most by universities and by other institutions. Instead of, if a university does it, it is that less likely for it to be regulated and checked and balanced, because it's literally students and teachers the ones who are doing so.
Thank you. I don't see where that's actually not true, because if you have a company that has its own research group, it means that it will not be as transparent as a group in the Oxford, which means that it will be unable to actually regulate and see what is actually happening with the research being made. And secondly, we believe that again, Oxford and Harvard are not likely to actually manipulate with the data, with all the information that an analysis, structural analysis, we get to in our first argument, never rebuttal. Now, I'm going to give an integrated rebuttal to their point about research in my argument, which is titled Allowing Crucial Research to Happen. So you have to realize that companies that want to research to yield the best results, because they want to be compatible on the market, right? If, for example, if you have a research that has fake information in it, it will be very easy for your component to actually figure that out, expose you, and make you less compatible on the market. Or if the research is not as good as it should be, it will be very easy for some other company to make a better research, which means that companies that are profit-driven have a great incentive to have great researchers be done. But why is that crucial? No, thank you. 3 reasons. 1, because institutions now get a lot more resources to actually make the researches that they are doing, right? Because if you have more money to pay your employees, you can have more employees, which means more ideas, more students in the research group. But secondly, you also can get money for the equipment. You have to realize that when we talk about great researchers, such as researchers into the, for example, fusion reactors that are currently in a very valid way of getting electricity in a much more ecologically good way, you need money to actually make a whole reactor, and that is a lot of money that no institution actually has, only companies can provide it. But thirdly, because they can finance all these researchers for a much longer time that currently those institutions can, because when you have a headmaster that changes, for example, in Oxford, and when he doesn't prioritize, for example, making some very ecological thing or any other sort of research, he will just stop it because he will prioritize the money to give it somewhere else. But comparatively, when he gets the money for that exact research every year, he will be very likely to invest in it further on because he gets the money for it. So we have better research on either side. But why is that crucial? One, because researchers that institutions, that companies fund are sometimes extremely crucial for the world. For example, the researchers that are done on ecological problems, which Bezos funds because he wants the ecology, the world not to die in the future 20 years. And this money is crucial because otherwise no institutions would actually be able to pull it off. But secondly, because when you have COVID-19 happening, it's crucial that you have as many money as possible to have the best equipment, the best researchers working on it. Lastly, we say that the takeaway of this argument is that we are the only one able to actually get the crucial development in emergency situations, and the development in general, researchers in general pulled off, which is all good for the people all over the world. And even if we are not able to prove anything else, just for the sake of COVID-19, all of you, I believe, care about, you should vote op.
I would like to thank the second op speaker, and I now invite third prop. I will be back in like 10 seconds. I'm just going to grab some water.
Sure.
Okay, third prop whenever you are ready. Would you like the screen sharing on or off?
I might rather not have it, but it's not
Okay.
huge. I would also appreciate if I receive POIs every 15 seconds rather than. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Side opposition tells you the reason for why these companies go to universities is because they want legitimacy, because they want the renowned names of specific universities within communities, or for example, Oxford, because people care about that. Simultaneously, they say most people don't care about data, most people don't care about legitimacy. If their whole case is contingent on the types of things and the type of information that happens, then I do think that they have taken it down. I want to make the most important explanation in this debate before I do 2 points of clash, because I think this wins us the debate. I want to characterize which are the types of institutions that normally go into universities, because this debate doesn't necessarily happen on the dichotomy that they talk about, right? Like this, they say if they don't go to universities, they will just do the research on their own, and therefore that will not be controlled. We think those institutions are already doing so, right? The types of companies that can already do the research on their own or by someone that is not a college will do it on their own. The question therefore in the debate is what types of institutions go to universities and why we win them. The types of universities that go are the ones that want a legitimacy from those universities just by saying this study was created by a university that we had no basic relationship with. And second of all, that it is just easier for those processes to happen. I want to be very clear that with this characterization, what we prove is that the counterfactual is not necessarily what they talk about, right? I don't think that those are likely to just go into these instances. And I think that even if they do, they already concede that this happens in the status quo and that people already don't believe it. I think the majority of people already understand that if a pharmaceutical company did it, you have less legitimacy than if Oxford University or a bad university, but still a university which is focused on science, for example, gave you the legitimacy, even if it was a bad process. They still haven't engaged with what happens when they are literally lying, which I think we have told you in two speeches is likely to happen. Let's go into the 2 questions in this debate. Where do you have better research and where the universities complete their roles more on either side? So the first thing that they say is they need research because the alternative will be worse. The first thing that we say is you have to engage with the instances in which the research through these universities is bad. They haven't given a structural analysis on what happens when a poor university, a university that doesn't have that many resources, is literally coerced into the only way in which you're going to have computers, the only way in which you're going to have technology, that is their second and third argument, to these types of results. Now, they say, no, thank you, please wait 15 seconds. They say we can have regulations, right? We can say you just don't lie, you can be transparent. That is literally the status quo. And what we said since first prop is the problem is not that they're actively lying in many instances. The problem in many instances is that they just tell them how to do the research and how to create the experiments, and so that the information seems legitimately. That is why we in society believe that water is necessary, as Maria talked about, because that process happened not through literally saying things that are false, but just through throwing the information that helped the companies that were bottling water, for example. The second response that we would give is that even if schools are diametrically more honest, and let's say that schools are always more honest, I don't think that that is necessarily the role. And the reason that we gave to you is that we would prefer for universities to only focus on the research that they want to have by themselves. That is to say, we would say that the purpose of these institutions is to maximize their areas of knowledge and their areas of research. And that only happens when you don't have a contract that says you only get to research about this. In many instances, students cannot literally experiment things that go against something that another student or another area of the university signed in favor of because of a company. No, thank you. We say that the government is better on our side through standardization. And I think because they are all giving resources to all types of universities, and it is very hard for the government to have specific bias with one university. I think when on their side, some governments don't have to give resources to a large amount of universities because those universities depend on privates, then it is more likely for the government to have specialized attention into some universities and therefore be more biased. But I think you hear no reason as for why it's one or the other. If opposition says government is politicized and it is bad, and we say companies are politicized and are bad, I don't necessarily understand why they would want to have both on their side, right? I just feel like you minimize the risks if you ban one of the actors that they concede in some instances can be bad. I want to clarify this point on the Oxford vaccine, like the example that we give on our third argument. Our point was not that a company is funding Oxford University. Oxford University is a multi-million worth university that at the end of the day doesn't need that funding. What they are doing indeed is working together. That is to say there will be no opportunity cost. They can check and balance each other. That is how we absorb the benefits of a student that wants to catapult their career. They can work on those projects, they can work with other institutions, but the funding, the incentives should not just be created by privates. So what else can they do? They can go into institutions who are only focused on research that are more likely to be regulated. All of academia can check and balance them. Universities themselves can have the role of checking and balancing others, right? But when it is these universities, the ones that are creating this, it is unlikely that someone regulates them. What are the incentives to have more funding onto research on our side? Incentives that, by the way, they have not answered to. The first is we said it is more likely for them to relocate resources within universities. There are many universities in the world who are not putting enough resources from the university and for example, what the university is being paid by students into research, and they rather put it in sports or building another part of infrastructure just because they can depend on privates for this area. We think those resources do exist. It's just a matter of relocation that would be better. Second, we say it is more likely that you force the government into having to give more funding. We said on our third argument, which doesn't receive the specific answer that we think wins them this point, that in many instances, the reason why some universities receive more funding is because they are just creating more resources and more investigation, for example. And they just have more investigation because privates are incentivized in them. And there is a reason why Oxford, although they are stupidly rich already, receive more and more money because they have those incentives. I think others would be protected on our side. Yes.
Notice the comparative that some research and some equipment cannot be obtained if you do not have.
The first thing is, to make that argument, you should have engaged with the governmental justification that we give in the first argument. We said, if there is such a big problem that it affects the majority of society, for example, the fact that there might be false information, that is enough to ban, even if good impacts can be created from that. The potential for abuse was enough for us to ban, and they haven't answered for why that potential of abuse isn't enough. So let's engage with the instance in which this is the only thing that is like the only way, right? You only get these resources. Even if we take them at their best and we say in some instances we would rather them not having that technology, not having that because they cannot consent to other areas, we think it's better. I think in many instances what this looks like is I will give you computers, for example, and I will brand the university with my company only if you do that. The problem with this is you directly affect students in other areas that you should care more about. Talk about University of Toronto, McMaster, New York, Pennsylvania, students who in the 90s and in the beginning of 2010 were literally expelled from their universities because they didn't support the types of research that these companies wanted. I think the ability of not consenting to that is more important than the possible benefits that you get from more money entering in these universities. We have told you money is enough. We don't necessarily feel like that is better. What ultimately we say is that if they want to go to the legitimacy of these universities, at least we take it down. So the opportunity cost is in many instances from doing what they want, from researching the things that they prefer. They say that they want companies with legitimacy. This is in complete contradiction to what they were saying on why ultimately people don't necessarily care about this legitimacy in the first place. Lastly, I think if they want to claim that resources only come from these privates, then I think that is literally the scapegoat for the government to just continue to give resources to areas of the economy or to areas of education that no longer need. So we think generally it is fair enough for us to say governments do have money that they can relocate, and you only incentivize them to do so and to create the impacts of second and third when these are not dependent on privates we are so proud.
I would like to thank third prop, and I now invite third op.
Am I audible? Is everything okay with my connection? Because I had some problems again. Cool, thank you. Just give me a second, please. Team Mexico just delivered a very convincing speech. But one problem with that speech, right? They're confusing all the stakeholders, smashing them in one big pile and not taking into account the nuance we brought on up. So firstly, let's deal with why their impacts are not standing. First question then, who cares about research, right? Because third prop tries to characterize that we have attention when we say that people don't care about research, but then we say that companies want legitimacy. So let's clear that up. First of all, we don't think our average Joe cares about legitimacy in the sense that they want to see research about the effects of fracking on the environment in Pennsylvania. It's going to decide based on different factors such as material incentives. On the other hand, right, investors, people who are doing research, journalists, actually care about the legitimacy of the research. And those are two different stakeholders that we bring in this debate, right? Because people who invest their money into certain products, who are afraid of certain liabilities that inadequate research might bring with it, are actually willing to care about research. And those two different stakeholders are not engaged on proposition. So why then is their first argument not applicable to this debate? No, thank you. Firstly, because when people don't care about where these facts come from, we are telling you that people won't care about politicization anymore on our side of the house than on their side of the house. Secondly, because we tell you that even, look, let's take the matter west. Even if people care about scientific opinions, we think people care more about scientific consensus. So the side that says we have 9,000 scientists supporting us, than on the side that brings you 10 research papers on their side of the house. They are non-comparative in this debate. They cannot bring this argument if they cannot prove any change. However, lastly, Emma brings you a nuanced analysis about how those companies are more likely to do either in-house research or do an independent institution research. Three reasons why this is worse. Firstly, because they don't have to care about their reputation. The response we get from prop, but oh, because there is reputation, nobody challenges Harvard. That's bullshit. Harvard is constantly challenged by Yale. Harvard is constantly challenged by other Ivy League schools. We don't know which world they're debating this. Secondly, we talk that you have peer review articles that are able to challenge your opinions, and those are more likely to happen when you publish something in academic journals, because you want to prove to your university that Yale is better than Harvard, an incentive that doesn't exist on their side. We have more control on our side when more people are likely to challenge the assertions of those things because simply factor of the academic, competition. So why is this important to this debate? Because it means that it makes all of the impacts of the proposition worse on their side of the house. When there is less accountability, when there is less opportunity to actually get quality research, all of those things they have not engaged with till this point. However, now secondly, let's move into the second clash about the practicalities, right? Here again, they mix two stakeholders together. We give you two separate arguments. Firstly, we talk about universities with high prestige, such as Oxford and Yale, Ivy League universities, that are more likely to do better research and are able to do this research only with corporate sponsorship. Jana's third argument. She tells you that one, this brings more money for those institutions in the first place, that they are able to disperse differently. Meaning that on our side of the house, when you get millions for researching the effects of fracking on the environment, you have more money to put into social sciences as well, because you're able to distribute it better. Secondly, Anna tells you that simply governments and universities themselves cannot provide huge sums required for some research. For example, the research of COVID vaccine. We cannot simply bring that money magically out of the air because we don't think that this is how things actually work in real life. However, secondly, even if governments are able to bring this money in, this means cuts in social welfare. This means less money for deep privileged universities who do not have such reputation, failed to engage with nuance on opposition. Lastly, Anna tells you that it's about long-term investments for which governments do not have the same long-term incentives as the companies. Because if you're a company who is benefiting from fracking for thousands of years, tens of years in the future, you want to have good research on fracking. You want to show that you have all the things you need in case you have a libel lawsuit or whatever else, any other lawsuits, right? Governments don't care about this. They care only about voter trends, right? They care only about what people in this moment think. So now we might care about fracking, but when the economic depression from COVID-19 hits, probably no one's going to care about fracking because we will care about our jobs more. No engagement from proposition. So we believe that those, I will take in a second, that those universities that are actually good, that are not coerced by this research, are making better research and more research on our side of the house. I will take a PY.
Why can companies who need research validation not get it elsewhere with FDA or universities that they don't directly sponsor?
Because you just ignored my first analysis, which tells you why this is worse. At a point, yes, they will look for different means, but those means are worse. That is the whole point of our case. Please start engaging. Secondly, on the deep privileged communities, look, they just brush this clash off because Black people aren't in STEM and no university education is there for those poor communities in the status quo. First of all, we tell you that this is simply not the reality that we are talking about. There are many universities that need funding and they cannot get funding from the government because of different factors that Emma talked about, right? So their engagement then here is that because you have this private money in, you have high levels of coercion because they're able to force those institutions to accept bad deals in order to get this money. And we are like, we think firstly that this is still lesser of an extent compared to independent institutions and in-house research. We think it's higher level of coercion when someone can say literally, I will fire you if you don't prove those results to me, than in this case when you are like, I will take your $500,000 away from the university. But let's take them at their best. We still think that even if we get bad research, because when you take our minimization from scientific consensus into account, it's not so bad to have some bad research in exchange for people actually being able to get good education. How do we get better education on our side of the house? 4 layers. Firstly, because you have more money in the first place, because this is a money that on their side of the house is not given in the educational system on their side of the house. And especially, it's not given to deprivileged institutions that do not have this high reputation, that do not produce so good results. Secondly, because it's easier for you to attract more students and improve your level of education overall. Because when you have more students, you have more money from tuition fees or government subsidies, and thus you're able to make better education. Thirdly, because people in those deprivileged communities are able to get job opportunities at a point when you have literally a company sponsoring your master's research or whatever. They never engage with this point. We think you have more opportunities to get up the social ladder on the side of opposition than on the proposition. But lastly, even if we take them at the absolute worst, that research is horrible and that people are not really able to independently choose what they want to research as they brought in third pro. You know, the equipment that they get with this money stays after those companies leave as well. At a point when you have more and more money in there, when you have better labs, when you have better facilities for students, we are taking those things away. We are very willing to take this trade-off because it means that in the future, you will still be able to have this independent research that they want so much. But right now, people are not getting bad education just because they don't like private money. For all of those reasons, dear panel, firstly, because we show you that the alternatives are comparatively worse than the status quo. Secondly, because the argument of politicization does not play a role in the debate. And lastly, because we win on practicalities, the ballot is for opposition, so stick with us.
I would like to thank the third op speaker, and I now invite the op reply.
I think the faster scientists, wherever they're funded from, figure out how we get the vaccine for COVID-19, the better and more happier everybody in this debate is going to be. And with this sort of proposition is directly trying to limit that from happening at the point to which they say we don't like Oxford getting funded from corporations, when they're trying to find solutions to pressing problems that affect us all. Two quick questions in my speech. Firstly, about whether corporation-funded academic research is biased and influences certain stakeholders. And secondly, when do we get better with their impact? So firstly, the first thing that of proposition gives to us is an argument about public pressure, about how corporations are able to influence people into believing certain things and whatever. We gave to you certain analysis to all of the three speeches where we tell to you that sort of proposition doesn't directly solve this issue at the point of which these corporations have that incentive. They're still able to manipulate people into this through media, through lobbying governments, through other mechanisms. We don't think that they have been efficient at eliminating this problem. This argument is relevant. But secondly, and more importantly, they talked about how at the point of which corporations can find academic institutions, they're able to force the institutions into giving them research that they want, that they need, and give them legitimacy and give them the legitimacy that gives them credibility in the public's eye. Here's the problem that they have, right? Firstly, we think that the entirety of this argument stems from rich universities, elitist universities such as Oxford, Yale, and Harvard, which have that legitimacy and credibility in the public eye in the first place. We gave you analysis which told you why this specific stakeholder of universities cannot afford to be involved with such corporations at the point to which they have to maintain their reputation in order to get good enrollment, in order to get good credibility, in order to maintain legitimacy. That's why these corporations specifically are going to be careful what sort of research they produce, that is efficient, that is good, that it's not just yes-manning these corporations. But secondly, even if this happens, right, what this is largely going to happen in poor universities. The second argument I gave you in first opposition, where we told you that even if this happens, the comparative is that the poor universities from poor backgrounds, which don't have funding, which don't have equipment, which cannot be competitive, which cannot give access to education to many people from bad socioeconomic standards, are probably not going to be existent on this side of the house because they're unable to get those funds in the first place. We think that at the point to which they said, but governments can allocate these resources, we think they have been unable to do so in the first place. But secondly, we think that the corporations had that incentive to fund those universities because they want that research to be happening. We think that they wanted those people. We think that they can give them employment and so on. This is what they haven't been engaging with. But second question is where we talk about when do we actually get better societal impacts, right? Because we told you from opposition and not engaged with sort of proposition about how there are certain pressing issues that and at the point at which we're able to generate more knowledge and more solutions to solve them. This is when we're on the better side of the house. But also we told you that companies fund research not necessarily only to coerce the public into buying their products or whatever, but also because they need it, because they want to be competitive, because they want to have good products for the consumers. But we think this absolutely actually generates better outcomes because it generates more knowledge, generates more research. We think is good at the end of the day. But also the argument Yama gave you in third, right, which you talked about how there are certain issues where we need that ability to have maximum amount of research because, for example, we want to create a fission reactor, which scientists have been unable to get enough funds to see how to create that and get clean energy, and corporations are funding those types of research because they themselves want to create better, cleaner technologies for producing energy. We think this doesn't exist in sort of proposition because no government is able to fund billions of dollars in this type of research. But also when we're facing the crisis such as COVID, where millions of people are being impacted, we think that pharmaceutical companies again have an incentive to solve these issues because it gives them advantage. We think that you're taking that away, you're taking that social impacts away. Because of that, we're so happy to be a sort of opposition votes for Slovenia.
I would like to thank the op reply and I now invite the prop reply.
Am I audible again? Awesome.
Do you want the screen shared?
I don't mind since there's no POI, so whatever you guys prefer. Since first prop, we tell you it is legitimate for the government to intervene, not only when there is direct harm to people, which we prove to you through misinformation, but where there is a potential for misinformation and the harms are big enough that we would take the hit of banning those who aren't harmful. Why? In this sense, we believe that opposition is a lot like the companies that fund these sorts of research, because they want to confuse the public that this debate is a wash and that there aren't real harms, while ignoring the exclusive harms to their side. 2 points of clash that will make it extremely clear why side proposition has won this debate. First, where do we have more accountability? And second, where do we have better education and research? Let's talk about accountability. First, opposition mitigates their entire analysis on how these companies are going to be harmful towards these research institutions by saying these universities won't take the risk because their prestige is something that they really care about. I believe that when the only way that this research would be worth it for companies is if they get the stamp of validation by Harvard or by Stanford, then this is the only way that they would invest in those things. But they tell you about 2 worse alternatives that they consider. First, on the government, and second, on doing it through outside research. When we talk about the government, we tell you, even if we buy that the government is also an illegitimate actor, we prefer a world where we only have one bad actor, be that the government, whereas a world where we have the government being coercive towards universities and companies being coercive towards universities. That is the way in given in third, no response to that. But the second thing we tell you is that in the moment when the government standardizes these types of funding towards all universities, we don't believe that bias is that impactful anyway. The second thing we tell you is that we believe that governments can be held more accountable, because you can't just remove funding as a government in the moment when universities just don't satisfy your interests, because you as a government have a responsibility of providing these sorts of things to citizens anyway. When they talk about outside research, we believe that, again, when we recognize that these institutions and this academia provide a stamp of validation towards these individuals, we believe that in spite of companies going to other institutions to provide this sorts of research, they won't have the same impacts, and we believe that the rightful research that is created by these institutions is still going to be better. We give you 3 reasons as to why we believe that there's more accountability on companies and why this is worth it. First, because the status quo is one that is so secretive that the regulations that they talk about simply won't work. Second, because the margin of profit that these individuals would generate is immense, specifically talking about the types of products that are harmful and the types of products that we want to talk about in this debate. Thirdly, because many instances these universities are actually coerced to because precisely of their analysis that they give to you, that they need this money in order to create research. This gives me a perfect transition to the second point of clash. Where do we have better education and research? Opposition basically tells us these institutions won't get the funding for technology and research anyway. Other impacts, such as jobs, such as social mobility, are derivative from this initial premise being true. Why is it not true? I believe that as a society, we recognize 2 things regarding education. First, that it is something that is intrinsically valuable, and secondly, that it brings material benefits to society with what it creates and the people that it generates. I think that therefore we will find a way to fund these sorts of things, either through the government or through literal other alternatives that we give you, such as tuition, such as students, such as alumni who have an emotional connection to this university and therefore want to give back to it. But we tell you, even if we get less funding for things such as technology and research, we think our side is still better. 4 reasons for it. First, because we believe that this is a vicious cycle where the government gives funding to individuals, to universities who have the greatest amount of research, and therefore this is something that never ends. Secondly, because these universities notably lose agency in spite of having money. When you can't choose where to use that money, we don't think it's worth it. This means that you lose intellectual endeavor of these individuals. This means that you have an opportunity cost of not being able to research into the things that your students want and that you as an institution want, or the things that are literally just more beneficial to society. In that sense, we get better education, we get more accountability, and I am so proud to propose as Team Mexico.
I would like to thank Prop Reply and thank everyone for the debate.
Thanks for the debate in Mexico.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.